Dust choked the dropship cabin. 30 recruits gripped their harnesses, faces pale beneath tactical visors. A klaxon blared, drowning out atmospheric friction. Most species would pray. Terran cadets just checked weapon safeties and grinned, waiting for the floor to drop out completely. Commander Sullivan rubbed the bridge of his nose. The translator implant buried behind his left ear was giving him a massive headache, but it was nothing compared to the migraine unfolding in front of him. Sullivan was a decorated officer of the Valarian fleet. His species valued logic, clean geometric lines, and directed energy weapons that vaporized targets without leaving a mess. When High Command ordered him to observe the primate Deathworlders at their premier military academy, he assumed he'd see primitive but rigidly organized training. Perhaps kinetic targeting ranges. Maybe some basic orbital calculus classes in sterile lecture halls. Instead, he was standing in a swamp. Rain lashed sideways across the United Nations Earth Military Academy. It was 0400 hours local time. The temperature hovered just a fraction above freezing. Sergeant Miller, a slab of human muscle wrapped in a waterproof poncho, paced in front of 60 shivering cadets. They stood waist-deep in a trench of freezing, viscous mud, holding what looked like heavy iron logs over their heads. "Is this a punitive measure?" Sullivan asked. He huddled beneath a synthesized thermal umbrella, his datapad shielded from the downpour. General Mitchell, the human liaison standing beside him, took a slow sip from a battered steel thermos. He didn't even shiver. "No, this is Tuesday." Sullivan blinked his secondary eyelids, zooming his ocular implants in on the recruits. "They are holding raw, unpolished iron pipes in freezing water. Their thermal readouts indicate mild hypothermia. One of them is bleeding from the nose." "Builds character," Mitchell said. Sullivan typed furiously on his datapad. "Report entry 41. Terran military training appears indistinguishable from harsh penal servitude. Recommend updating psychological profiles of all human personnel to reflect severe masochistic tendencies." He looked back up. Sergeant Miller stopped pacing and leaned directly into the face of a cadet. The kid couldn't have been more than 18 standard cycles. His arms trembled violently under the weight of the iron pipe. His knuckles were bone white. "Having trouble, Cadet Wyatt?" Miller's voice was a gravelly bark, cutting right through the howling wind. "No, Drill Sergeant," Wyatt screamed back. Muddy water poured over his helmet and into his open mouth. He spat it out without breaking eye contact. "Good. Because if you drop that log, I will make you eat it. Then I will make you run up that hill and throw it back up. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, Drill Sergeant." Sullivan shuddered. A Valarian recruit would have filed 3 administrative grievances and transferred to the logistics corps by now. These humans just screamed back, their eyes wild, completely devoid of basic self-preservation. It was barbaric. It was stupid. It was terrifying. The morning dragged on without mercy. Sullivan watched as the cadets were finally pulled from the mud, only to be immediately sent on a 10-mile run carrying 40-pound packs. No breakfast, no thermal blankets, just heavy boots hitting the asphalt in a steady, hypnotic, miserable rhythm. He followed in a hover jeep with Mitchell. The general offered him a cup of the dark, bitter liquid humans called coffee. Sullivan politely declined. The last time he tried a human stimulant, his hearts had fluttered dangerously for a standard week. "Why do you break them down like this?" Sullivan asked. He watched Cadet Wyatt stumble, scrape his knee on the rough tarmac, and immediately get hauled back to his feet by a female cadet beside him. "Because war breaks you down," Mitchell said. His tone wasn't boastful or aggressive. It was just tired. "Out there, on the fringe, the enemy doesn't care if you're cold. They don't care if you're tired. If we don't teach them how to function when they have absolutely nothing left in the tank, they will die." Sullivan watched the female cadet, Cadet Carter, according to his facial recognition overlay, shoulder half of Wyatt's pack while continuing to carry her own. She was struggling. Her breathing was ragged, her face pale. But she didn't stop moving forward. Report Entry 42, Sullivan drafted in his mind. Terrans possess an illogical pack-bonding instinct. They will actively compromise their own physical integrity to prevent the failure of a weaker unit. A critical tactical vulnerability? Or a strange, chaotic strength? The afternoon shifted from physical torture to simulated combat. Sullivan felt slightly more in his element here. The viewing gallery hovered safely above a massive modular arena. The holographic terrain currently displayed a ruined urban center. Grey ash fell from a synthetic sky, coating shattered concrete and rusted vehicles. Scenario 4, Mitchell announced, tapping the reinforced glass. Urban extraction. Hostiles have massive numeric superiority. The squad must retrieve a dummy payload from the central plaza and extract under heavy fire. Sullivan checked the tactical parameters on his datapad. They are outnumbered 10 to 1. The simulated enemy possesses superior plasma weaponry and elevated firing positions. The cadets have... What is this? Stun rounds? Standard kinetic blanks, Mitchell confirmed. Leaves a nasty bruise if it hits you. Keeps them honest. This scenario is mathematically impossible, Sullivan stated flatly. A Valerian squad would immediately retreat and call for orbital bombardment to clear the sector. We don't always have orbital support, Commander. Down in the ruins, Cadet Carter's squad stacked up against a crumbling brick wall. There were 6 of them. Wyatt was carrying a heavy support weapon. Carter had a standard-issue kinetic rifle. The others, Brooks, Cooper, Logan, and Price, checked their gear with nervous, twitchy energy. The simulation began. Instantly, the plaza erupted. Synthetic plasma fire rained down in brilliant, lethal arcs. Red streaks of light hammered the squad's position, shattering the holographic bricks and sending real debris flying. The noise was deafening, a percussive roar that made Sullivan's audio receptors dial down automatically. Sullivan watched the tactical feed. A Valerian squad would have held position, calculated precise firing arcs, and waited for a statistically viable opening. The humans didn't wait. "Covering fire!" Carter roared, her voice cracking. Wyatt stepped out. He didn't lean around the side of the wall. He vaulted entirely over a low concrete barrier, screaming at the top of his lungs, and laid down a suppressive wall of kinetic fire. It was wildly inaccurate, but insanely loud. The synthetic enemy AI actually paused for a fraction of a second, its combat algorithms struggling to process the sheer, suicidal brazenness of the maneuver. "They are wasting ammunition," Sullivan muttered. "Keep watching," Mitchell said, leaning forward. While the AI was focused on the screaming idiot with the heavy machine gun, Carter and Cooper sprinted directly through the crossfire. They didn't run in a straight line. They zigzagged wildly, diving into the mud, sliding across the hoods of rusted car chassis, scrambling on all fours. It was ugly. It lacked all military elegance. But it worked. Carter reached the payload, a heavy, reinforced metal crate. She grabbed one handle. Cooper grabbed the other. "Payload secured! Fall back!" Carter yelled over the din. The AI readjusted. 3 synthetic snipers appeared on the rooftops overlooking the plaza, painting the extraction route with bright green laser targeting sights. "They are pinned," Sullivan observed, feeling a grim sense of vindication. The snipers have a clear line of sight on the only viable exit route. The simulation is over. Down in the mud, Carter looked at the crate. Then she looked at Cooper. She tapped her helmet, pointing at a dilapidated structural support pillar holding up the second floor of the building where the snipers were positioned. Cooper nodded. He didn't hesitate. He pulled a simulated high-explosive charge from his tactical webbing. "Wait!" Sullivan stepped closer to the glass, his eyes widening. "That building is directly adjacent to their position. If they destroy that pillar, the blast radius and falling debris will—" Cooper threw the charge. It magnetically locked onto the pillar. "Fire in the hole!" Boom! The explosion rocked the viewing gallery. Smoke, dust, and debris swallowed the street. The heavy concrete facade of the building groaned, then collapsed downward in a cascade of destruction, bringing the synthetic snipers crashing into the street in a massive shower of sparks and rubble. A thick cloud of pulverized concrete plumed into the air, completely blinding the remaining enemy forces. Out of that suffocating dust emerged Carter and Cooper. They were dragging the payload, coughing violently, entirely coated in grey ash. Wyatt and the rest of the squad laid down blind covering fire into the smoke, walking backwards toward the extraction zone. A klaxon blared. Simulation complete. Scenario passed. Sullivan stared at the tactical display. The squad had taken 60% simulated casualties in the form of deep tissue bruising. They were out of breath, covered in filth, and their gear was ruined. But the payload was in the extraction zone. He looked at Mitchell. The general was smiling. Sullivan opened his datapad. He deleted his previous note. Report entry 43. Do not engage Terrans in urban combat. They do not care about collateral damage, mathematical probability, or standard tactical doctrine. They will blow up a building they are standing next to, just to create a distraction. They are completely, profoundly insane. Impressive, Sullivan managed to say, his voice tight, but completely reckless. If that charge had been placed 2 meters to the left, they would have buried themselves alive. But he didn't put it 2 meters to the left, Mitchell replied calmly. He put it exactly where it needed to go. Down on the simulation floor, the cadets were pulling off their heavy helmets. They were exhausted. Cooper was bleeding from a shallow cut on his cheek, where a piece of real shrapnel had bounced past his visor. Carter was leaning against the heavy crate, hands on her knees, gasping for air. Sullivan watched as Wyatt walked over and punched Cooper hard in the shoulder. It wasn't a hostile strike. It was a bizarre gesture of affection. Cooper laughed, shoved Wyatt back, and then Carter joined in, slapping them both on the back. They had just survived a simulated meat grinder. They were bleeding, they were exhausted, and they were laughing. Sullivan felt a cold sweat prickle the back of his neck. His species fought wars because it was sometimes mathematically necessary for survival. They fought with grim determination and cold, sanitized efficiency. These humans, they fought like cornered animals, and worse, they seemed to enjoy the absolute absurdity of it all. Later that night, Sullivan found himself standing on a balcony overlooking the dark academy grounds. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the concrete damp and reflecting the harsh floodlights. Mitchell walked out, holding 2 glass tumblers. He handed one to Sullivan. It contained a dark amber liquid. "What is this?" Sullivan asked, sniffing it cautiously. It smelled like wood smoke and engine solvent. "Bourbon," Mitchell said. "A traditional human beverage for concluding a successful operation. Don't worry, it won't stop your hearts. Just sip it." Sullivan took a tiny sip. It burned the whole way down, leaving a warm, fiery glow in his chest. He coughed, but found it oddly soothing against the chill of the damp air. "You've been quiet today, Commander," Mitchell noted, leaning his forearms against the railing. "Your report getting too thick to carry?" Sullivan looked at his datapad resting on the ledge. He had enough data to write a dozen field manuals on human insanity, but he knew none of the statistics would truly capture what he had witnessed. "General," Sullivan began, his voice barely a whisper in the dark. "My species has existed for 100,000 years. We have conquered disease, poverty, and most forms of internal conflict. Our military is a surgical instrument. He turned to look at the human. Your species is fractured. You are volatile. You ingest botanical defense neurotoxins for flavor, poison yourselves with ethanol for entertainment, and subject your young to torture just to teach them resilience. By all logical metrics, you should have destroyed yourselves centuries ago. Mitchell took a slow sip of bourbon. We came close. A few times. So why didn't you? Sullivan pressed, genuine desperation creeping into his voice. What is the variable I am missing? Why, when faced with overwhelming odds in that simulation, did your cadets not surrender? What is the logic? Mitchell stared out over the empty parade grounds. There is no logic, Commander. That's the secret. You're looking for an equation. We don't operate on math. We operate on spite. Sullivan frowned, his translator struggling with the nuance. Spite? Spite. Stubbornness. The sheer, irrational refusal to go quietly into the dark, Mitchell said, his voice lowering, turning rough. The universe is a cold, hostile place. It wants to kill us. It always has. So we decided a long time ago that we were going to make it very, very hard for the universe to get its way. Sullivan looked back down at his datapad. He selected all his meticulously gathered tactical notes. The weapon ranges, the physical endurance metrics, the psychological profiles. He hit delete. He needed to start over. He needed High Command to understand that if the Galactic Coalition ever went to war with Earth, they wouldn't be fighting an army. They would be fighting a force of nature that thrived in the mud. The screaming of metal against metal echoed through the cavernous bay of the Academy's motor pool. Commander Sullivan winced, his audio dampeners struggling to filter out the high-frequency screech. To a Valerian, engineering was a sacred discipline. A starship's drive core was tuned in clean rooms by technicians wearing sterilized environmental suits. Diagnostics were run through triple-redundant quantum processors before a single physical tool was ever lifted. Chief Warrant Officer Henderson, a man whose coveralls were more grease than fabric, was currently attempting to repair the primary plasma manifold of a heavy troop transport by hitting it repeatedly with a massive steel wrench. "Come on, you absolute piece of garbage," Henderson grunted, punctuating each word with a violent swing. Clang, clang, clang. Sullivan stared. He looked at General Mitchell, who was leaning against a stack of heavily worn tires, casually chewing on a piece of dried meat. "General," Sullivan said, his voice trembling slightly. "That manifold contains highly pressurized ionized gas. If the microfractures in the casing expand by even a millimeter, the resulting explosion will vaporize this entire bay." Mitchell didn't stop chewing. Henderson knows what he's doing. He is using blunt force trauma on a quantum fluid routing system, Sullivan insisted. This violates every known safety protocol in the Galactic Coalition database. Down in the maintenance pit, Henderson paused. He wiped a streak of black oil across his forehead with the back of a filthy glove. He stared at the manifold, let out a heavy sigh, and reached into a toolbox. He pulled out a roll of heavy-duty, silver-colored adhesive tape. Sullivan's jaw dropped as he watched the human wrap the tape tightly around the critical pressure valve. "There," Henderson muttered. "That ought to hold the bastard together until drop day." He climbed out of the pit, wiped his hands on a rag, and slapped the side of the transport's armored hull. The engine whined, sputtered, and then roared to life with a deafening, vibrating hum. It didn't explode. "How?" Sullivan whispered. He pulled out his datapad, his thumbs hovering over the glass. "What is the structural tensile strength of that silver membrane?" "Duct tape," Mitchell said. "And nobody knows. It's a mystery lost to time. We just know it holds the universe together." Sullivan typed, "Report entry 61. Terran mechanical maintenance relies on a localized kinetic impact technique they call percussive maintenance, followed by the application of a primitive adhesive strip. It defies all laws of physics. It is highly unstable. It works flawlessly. Mitchell offered Sullivan a piece of the dried meat. The Valerian eyed it suspiciously. "Beef jerky," Mitchell explained. "Preserved animal protein. Good for the field." Sullivan took a small piece and chewed. It was incredibly salty, tough as old boots, and tasted faintly of smoke. It was utterly devoid of the complex, synthetic nutrients his species engineered into their rations. He found himself taking another bite anyway. "You see, Commander," Mitchell said, looking out over the rows of scarred, dented, and patched-together vehicles. Out in the deep black, when a hyperdrive blows a gasket 3 light years from the nearest supply depot, a pristine lab won't save you. A manual won't save you. Mitchell turned to look Sullivan directly in the eyes. His gaze was sharp, devoid of any pretense. When everything goes wrong, and it always goes wrong, we don't want engineers who only know how to fix things when conditions are perfect. We want grease monkeys who can look at a catastrophic system failure, grab a roll of tape and a wrench, and drag the ship back home on pure, unadulterated spite. Sullivan chewed the salty meat in silence. He looked back at Henderson, who was now kicking the treads of a tank to test their tension. The Valarian military doctrine relied on superiority. Superior technology, superior numbers, superior positioning. If a Valarian unit lost their primary advantages, they fell back. They waited for resupply. Humans didn't wait. Humans broke their own equipment to make it fit a new purpose. They cannibalized parts. They improvised. Sullivan deleted a whole section of his report, detailing the vulnerabilities of human supply lines. It was irrelevant. You couldn't starve an army that considered eating old boots a valid survival tactic, and you couldn't cripple a mechanized unit that repaired plasma drives with brute force and adhesive strips. "Report entry 62, Sullivan typed. "Do not target Terran supply lines. It only makes them angry and resourceful. A Terran with a broken weapon is simply a Terran looking for a heavier rock to throw." The rain returned on the final night of Sullivan's observation. It was a torrential downpour, turning the heavily forested mountain ranges bordering the academy into a freezing, slippery nightmare. This was the culminating field exercise, a simulated combat drop deep into hostile territory. No holographic arenas this time, real mountains, real mud, and real instructors hunting the cadets through the dark. Sullivan sat in the command center, wrapped in a heavy thermal blanket. A massive tactical table glowed in the center of the dark room, displaying the GPS trackers of the cadet squads as tiny blue dots. The instructor-hunter teams were represented by red triangles. "The objective," Mitchell explained, pointing to a glowing green beacon at the top of a steep ridge, "is to bypass the hunter teams, scale the ridge, and activate the distress beacon. If they are captured, they fail. If they freeze, they fail. If they quit, they fail." "They have been in the field for 72 hours, Sullivan noted, looking at the biometric readouts. "Their core temperatures are dropping. Caloric deficits are critical. They are hallucinating." "Yes," Mitchell said softly. Sullivan watched the blue dots. Cadet Carter's squad was pinned in a narrow ravine. 3 red triangles were closing in on the mouth of the pass. The instructors were equipped with night vision optics, thermal imaging, and silent hover drones. The cadets had standard kinetic rifles loaded with blanks, a length of rope, and whatever they had managed to forage. "They are trapped," Sullivan said. He pointed to the topographical display. "The walls of the ravine are too steep to climb in this mud. The enemy has the choke point. Mathematically, it is over." Down in the dark, Carter, Wyatt, and Cooper were huddled under the roots of a massive, overturned tree. Cold water cascaded over their helmets. "They're waiting us out," Wyatt whispered, his teeth chattering so violently Sullivan could hear it through the command center's audio feed. Carter wiped a layer of thick, freezing mud from her visor. "They have thermals. We can't sneak past." Cooper stared at the steep, treacherous walls of the ravine. "So we don't sneak." In the command center, Sullivan leaned closer to the audio monitors. "What are they planning?" "Quiet," Mitchell ordered. "Wyatt, you still have those 2 flashbangs you stole from the quartermaster's tent before we dropped?" Cooper asked. "Yeah. But if I throw them, they'll know exactly where we are." "That's the point," Carter said, her voice suddenly tightening with a grim realization. She looked at Cooper. "You want to trigger a mudslide?" Sullivan gasped. "They will kill themselves. The kinetic force required to destabilize that embankment will bury the entire ravine." "Watch," Mitchell said, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the tactical table. Down in the rain, the squad moved. Wyatt crawled forward on his belly, sinking deep into the freezing slop. He pulled the pins on both flashbangs. "Hey, assholes!" Wyatt screamed into the dark. He threw the grenades high up onto the steep, unstable slope of the ravine, directly above the choke point where the instructors were waiting. The double detonation was a blinding flash of white light and a concussive roar that echoed off the mountain walls. The earth groaned. Thousands of pounds of saturated mud, rocks, and dead trees detached from the ravine wall. It came down like a freight train. The red triangles on the tactical map rapidly retreated as the instructors scrambled to avoid being crushed by the localized avalanche. The avalanche completely buried the mouth of the ravine. It also created a massive, ramp-like mound of packed debris leaning against the opposite wall. "Go! Go! Go!" Carter yelled. The cadets didn't run away from the slide. They ran directly toward it. They scrambled up the fresh, shifting mound of debris, using exposed roots and jagged rocks as handholds. They were climbing the wreckage they had just created to escape the trap. Sullivan watched, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer lunacy of the maneuver. They were exhausted, freezing and starving, yet they clawed their way up the vertical face of the landslide with frantic, animalistic energy. 10 minutes later, a blue dot crested the top of the ridge. Then another. A green light flashed on the command console. The distress beacon had been activated. The room was silent, save for the hum of the tactical table. Mitchell let out a long, slow breath. He reached for his battered thermos and took a drink of cold coffee. He looked at Sullivan. "Mathematical probability, Commander," Mitchell said quietly, "rarely accounts for human desperation." Sullivan didn't argue. He couldn't. He looked at the biometric data of Carter's squad. Their heart rates were through the roof. Their muscles were tearing. They were broken, battered, and completely exhausted. But they had won. The Valerian pulled out his datapad one last time. He opened his official report to High Command. He deleted the section on kinetic ballistics. He deleted the section on atmospheric endurance. He deleted everything. He typed a single, final paragraph. Report entry. Final. Do not fight them. Do not provoke them. The Terran military is not an organization of soldiers. It is a brotherhood of madmen. They will turn their environment into a weapon. They will break their own bones to secure a victory. They will blow up a mountain just to build a bridge. Treat with them. Trade with them. Drink their ethanol and eat their preserved meats. But under no circumstances should the Galactic Coalition ever stand between a human and their objective. Sullivan powered down the datapad and placed it in his pocket. He looked at Mitchell. "General," Sullivan said, his voice carrying a new, profound weight of respect. "When the cadets return from the field, I would very much like to buy Chief Henderson and Cadet Carter a glass of that bourbon." Mitchell smiled. It was a genuine, tired, deeply human smile. I think they'd like that, Commander. I think they'd like that a lot. So would you survive a week in the United Nations Earth Military Academy? Or would you tap out before the mud run? If Commander Sullivan's terrifying realization about human spite made your day, hit that like button and smash subscribe. Drop a comment below with your favorite human survival tactic and share this video with anyone who knows the true power of duct tape. Make sure your notifications are on for more HFY stories. Stay stubborn and keep fighting humanity.